Chapter 5, Towards an Anti-Zionist Zionism, end quote. In 2019, the Canary responded to the BBC Panorama documentary, Is Labor Anti-Semitic?, by, quote, exposing the fact that several of the Jewish contributors were members of the, quote, anti-Corbyn Jewish labor movement. One contributor's previous job at the Israeli embassy and another's job working for the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the main Jewish communal organization in Britain, were similarly, quote, exposed. The positioning of the Jewish labor movement on the center-right of the Labour Party's internal political spectrum is no secret. Undoubtedly, some of its members did and do have a more generalized opposition to Corbyn and the left. But the claim that this means that whatever they have to say about anti-Semitism can be dismissed out of hand is dangerous and wrong. The argument was, in effect, that Jews must pass a political loyalty test and be deemed sufficiently, quote, pro-Corbyn and anti-Zionist before they are permitted to speak about anti-Semitism without being immediately accused of ulterior conspiratorial motives. This is a political trap that renders the vast majority of Jews who are not left-wing anti-Zionists essentially fair game. Say whatever you like about the bad Zionist Jews, because if they object or complain, they will merely confirm their malicious anti-left scheming. If there is an approximate equivalent to this in recent public political discourse, it is the demand sometimes leveled at Muslims that they publicly disavow Islamism before being granted social permission to talk about anti-Muslim discrimination and prejudice. The left has rightly called this out, but sections of it replicate exactly the same logic when it comes to Jews. We, the left, should oppose Israel's oppressive policies and oppose Islamism and seek to persuade others, including Jews and Muslims, to disavow them too. But this should be because of a positive commitments to values to which those things run counter, not as loyalty tests demanded before people will be listened to when speaking about bigotry they face. The key to assert Jews' right to speak on anti-Semitism without being interrogated about their views on Israel is sometimes presented as an argument that tackling anti-Semitism must be strictly decoupled from any political discussion about Israel-Palestine, Zionism, or anti-Zionism. The impulse is understandable, a reflexive insistence that every discussion of anti-Semitism must become a discussion of policy for Israel-Palestine can be part of the problem. Linked to notions of collective Jewish responsibility for the policies of Israel, which Jews must first performatively disavow or apologize for before being allowed to speak about anti-Semitism. However, while the idea of collective Jewish responsibility for Israel must certainly be rejected, including when implied by the Israeli government itself, a strict separation between a discussion of the history and politics of Israel-Palestine and a discussion of anti-Semitism on the left is ultimately not possible. As the place of origin of Judaism as an ethnic religion, Jews have had a cultural and religious connection to what is now Israel-Palestine for centuries, and as we have seen in Chapter 4, left anti-Semitism since the 1950s has been so closely bound up with narratives about Israel-Palestine and Zionism that the issues cannot be considered in abstraction. Indeed, the history of European anti-Semitism has flowed into the history of Israel-Palestine. The Palestinian poet and activist Mahmoud Darwish, widely regarded as Palestine's national poet, said in an interview with the French-Israeli actor Sarah Adler, quote, "Do you know why we Palestinians are famous? Because you are our enemy. The interest in us stems from the interest in the Jewish question, ... We have the misfortune of having Israel as an enemy because it enjoys unlimited support. And we have the good fortune of having Israel as our enemy because the Jews are the center of world attention. You've brought us defeat and renown," end quote. The questions are not identical, But as Lebanese writer Joey Ayoub has said, history has substantially, quote, interlinked the Jewish question, which is in large part the question of how to respond to anti-Semitism, and the Palestinian question. This does not mean that anti-Semitism must be viewed through the prism of Israel-Palestine. Anti-Semitism far predates the modern concepts of both, quote, Israel and, quote, Palestine. Nor does it mean that anti-Semitism is a, quote, response, end quote, to events in Israel-Palestine, or that the struggle for Palestinian national rights must be viewed through the prism of anti-Semitism. But it does mean that consideration of each question must involve consideration of the other. This chapter will argue that a politics of equal rights, including equal national rights, and consistent solidarity can overcome the anti-Semitism implicit in some far-left thinking about Israel-Palestine, and thus take an approach to both the Jewish question and the Palestinian question consistent with socialist principles of equality and democracy. It is necessary at the outset to state some fundamental perspectives, not as qualifications or caveats required to gain permission to discuss anti-Semitism, but so readers are absolutely clear about the principles that inform and underlie my analysis. I hope that this book will be read by people who bring to it widely differing beliefs about Israel-Palestine, both those with some affinity with Israel, especially in Jewish communities, and those whose thinking is shaped by the absolute, unqualified forms of anti-Zionism prevalent on the far left. If it does not sound too grandiose to name, I hope to persuade both to question those beliefs. In both cases, they may proceed from understandable impulses, a sensitivity and opposition to historic anti-Semitism in the former, a vigorous opposition to the oppression of the Palestinians in the latter. Both of those impulses are legitimate. They are not mutually exclusive, and neither support for Israeli policy nor absolute anti-Zionism serves them well. Two peoples, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, inhabit the territory of historic Palestine. Both these peoples are national groups, a group that speaks a shared language, has a shared culture and a collective history, inhabits a discrete territory, is internally class differentiated, and sees itself as a nation. As argued in Chapter 1, nationhood is a construct, a, quote, imagined community, end quote, but it is a construct that cannot simply be wished out of existence. Between these two national peoples there exists a gross disparity of rights. The fundamental relation of power is not a conflict between equally matched sides, but one of national oppression, with the Israeli state blocking the full expression of Palestinians' right to national self-determination. The endeavor of socialist politics as it relates to Israel-Palestine must be to support a leveling up of rights, including national rights, between the two peoples, so that unity and common struggle between Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Arab workers, a necessary condition for the ultimate success of socialist politics, can be built free from the toxifying influence of colonialism and national oppression. This is the approach most consistent with the attitude of the majority of the pre-Stalinist revolutionary socialist tradition to questions of national oppression. Summarized in Karl Marx's phrase, quote, "A nation that oppresses another forges its own chains," end quote. Lasting peace, security, and freedom for Israeli Jews is possible only within a framework that guarantees those same rights to Palestinians. Leon Trotsky also expressed the classical socialist attitude to national oppression when Trotsky wrote, quote, "The removal of any, even disguised, even the most refined and practically, quote, imponderable, end quote, national oppression or indignity must be used for the revolutionary unification rather than the segregation of the workers of various nationalities. Wherever national privileges and injuries exist, nations must have the possibility to separate from each other, that thus they may facilitate the free unification of the workers in the name of a close rapprochement of nations with a distinct perspective of the eventual complete fusion of all," end quote. Trotsky. New section. For equal rights. Contemporary national oppression in Israel-Palestine is neither, quote, disguised nor, quote, refined. It is not an abstract constitutional arrangement, but a concrete material reality that has scarred the lives of generations of Palestinians, towards whom the state of Israel has been a brutal power. In the course of the war surrounding its foundation, the Palestinians suffered ethnic cleansing and displacement, refugees from which and their descendants have often continued to live in desperate conditions, an injustice for which both Israel and the cynical politicking of neighboring authoritarian regimes, which have denied equality to Palestinian refugees, share responsibility. Since 1967, Palestinians have been subjected to direct military occupation and blockade. The Palestinian minority inside pre-1967 Israel has faced intense racism and discrimination for decades via such mechanisms as the sponsoring of settlement, expansion, house demolitions in the West Bank, and bombardments of Gaza. Israeli policy has sought to atomize the material basis for a viable Palestinian national entity. In May 2021, Israeli bombing of Gaza killed 256 people, including 66 children. In all of this, the Israeli state has been motivated by what Edward Said called, quote, an utter refusal to accept the sovereign existence of a Palestinian people that is entitled to rights over ... the West Bank and Gaza, end quote. As a side note, you might want to check out the piece about Islamic anti-Semitism by Bassam Tibi. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But like his whole thing is like he's a staunch critic of Islamism and anti-Zionism, but he's also a critic, which I think is the sensible critique of the Israeli state, which is has done everything in its the Likud party, which has done everything in its power to block a two-state solution. It's not as if sometimes you could have the idea that it's like Israel wants a two-state solution and the Palestinians just won't have it. What seems more the case is a totalizing expansionism versus a totalizing irredentism, which will not create peace in the region at all. Those two perspectives. So the answer has to be a small Israel and a small Palestine of some kind, whose national borders are recognized as legitimate. And then from there, you can have, hopefully, at least, move towards a settlement that allows, more of a confederational relationship. Anyway, the left must support the Palestinian people's struggle to claim those rights. Nothing written in this chapter or elsewhere in this book is an argument for tempering that support, which must be full-throated and active. On the contrary, this chapter in particular aims to affirm that necessity. A politics of solidarity that does not license anti-Semitic variants of anti-Zionism as legitimate forms of opposition to Israeli state oppression will be more effective than one that does, as well as more consistent with socialist aims and principles. Despite its, quote, pseudo-emancipatory, end quote, claims, anti-Semitism, like all forms of chauvinism, bigotry, and racism, cannot be made to serve genuinely emancipatory ends, including the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and equality. Instances of anti-Semitism within movements of solidarity with the Palestinians are not merely bad PR, they are politically disorienting and toxifying. Oppression cannot be fought on the basis of a politics that advocates the oppression of others. Socialists, as people seeking to develop a worldview, have a duty to assess history in its totality, in all its complexity. Abstracting the history of Israel-Palestine from the history of world events, and from the historical experiences of both the Jewish and Arab peoples, cuts against the development of an egalitarian politics, and feeds a politics based on, usually vicarious, chauvinism. Socialist opposition to national oppression must be motivated by the principle that all peoples and communities are entitled to equal rights, and that justice comes from the leveling up of rights. Left anti-Semitism arises not from vigorous opposition to Israeli state policy, but from an abandonment of consistent democracy, and its replacement with campus historiographies, which are used to inform reactionary political conclusions. The prevalent historical political perspective towards Israel across much of the far left is summed up by the statement, quote, "There can be no peace while the state of Israel continues to exist," end quote. In other words, Israel is an illegitimate presence. Although it can be given a different twist depending on the context, the popular slogan, quote, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," end quote, can also imply that it's not Israel's policies of occupation or anti-Arab discrimination that make Palestinians unfree, but Israel's very existence, any territory, quote, "from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea," end quote, i.e. the whole of historic Palestine. There is no place for a national entity based on the Jewish population, or in some extreme versions of the position, the Jewish presence in the region at all. Nahuel Moreno, an Argentinian Trotskyist leader, whose political descendants are a relatively significant force on the far left in some South American countries, encapsulates this position clearly, advancing the slogan, quote, "Zionists out of Israel," end quote. What should happen to the, quote, Zionists, end quote, if the Zionists refused to leave was strongly implied. Quote, "Arab racism against Israel is progressive. It destroys the Zionist state," end quote. Moreno. I think Moreno is kind of a crank for other reasons. Not from my personal perspective, but I think people say that Moreno is a crank for other reasons in addition to this. I need to read the piece from Robert J. Alexander on Argentinian Trotskyism. In May 2021, an article on the Left Voice website, which has origins in the Moreno, quote, Morenoite tradition, suggested, quote, "free swimming lessons for Zionists," end quote, should accompany the, quote, "from the river to the sea," end quote, slogan on demonstrations. Jesus fucking Christ. The Socialist Workers' Party in the UK opposes the existence of Israel. It says it supports a, quote, "single secular state with equal democratic rights for all its citizens," end quote. But if the right to national self-determination, surely a, quote, "democratic right," end quote, in itself, is denied to either one of the two national peoples in Israel-Palestine, a single state will not be, quote, "equal." It is also not clear how the Socialist Workers' Party reconciles its professed support for a, quote, "secular state with its support for Hamas, a party with a foundational hostility to secularism, which aims to create a theocratic state. Underlying the claims of the essential illegitimacy of Israel is the idea that it is an artificial creation or implantation of imperialism, rather than a state based on a legitimate national community entitled to democratic rights. Often, British imperialism is held accountable, usually because of the Balfour Declaration, and sometimes Zionism itself is claimed to have manipulated imperialist policy, owing to the presence of, quote, "multimillionaires of Jewish origin," end quote, amongst the imperialist ruling classes. Chapter 4 examined the essentially Stalinist origins of this perspective. This chapter seeks to further explain what is anti-Semitic about those arguments and argue for an alternative political perspective based on solidarity and advocacy of equal rights. The State of Israel was not created by Britain. British policy oscillated on the question of Jewish immigration to and settlement in Palestine. Initially supporting and encouraging it, British colonial authorities were often the direct agents of the displacement of Arab communities who lived on land that had been sold to Jewish settlers who had been promised they would receive the land empty. It's important to know that there's, I think in many cases, that land was sold by Arab landlords to Jewish settlers. And it was promised that they would receive the land empty. So it would be like buying a house and there's people living in it, renting it. The state of Israel was not created by Britain. So where am I? But in 1929, an Arab attack on Jews in Hebron mobilized under slogans including, quote, "The British are with us," end quote. By the 1940s, keen to maintain its own colonial interest in gambling that the semi-feudal Arab ruling classes might be more reliable partners than Jewish settlers, British policy had shifted decisively to opposing unrestricted Jewish immigration and taking measures to limit it. British colonial authorities blocked shiploads of Holocaust refugees attempting to reach Palestine and detained them in camps on Cyprus. In 1947 to 48, British intelligence services went as far as to organize the bombing of ships docked in Italy, which were preparing to bring Holocaust refugees to Palestine. British officers led regiments in Arab armies in the 1948 war. This is not to suggest that the Arab side in the 1948 war was merely a cat's paw for British imperialism, or that British imperial policy played no role in the process of Israel's national formation. The period of British colonial support for Jewish immigration undoubtedly contributed to the establishment of a viable Jewish national community in Palestine. But narratives that see Israel as having been directly created by the reified agency of imperialism, and British imperialism specifically, are simplistic and imbalanced. They erase from the picture the national aspirations of the Jews of Palestine, which, whatever one thinks about their legitimacy, cannot be dismissed as merely an imperialist plot. In considering this history, both campist anti-Zionist and those who believe reformist social democracy represent a pristine alternative tradition, untainted by the left anti-Semitism held to be the preserve of the revolutionary left, should question their assumptions. The campist anti-Zionist should see that British imperialism, far from directly, quote, creating Israel, end quote, acted in its own interest, playing national communities against each other, attempting classic colonial tactics of divide and rule, and behaving foully toward Jewish refugees from Nazism. And you can say the same thing, I think you can say the same thing as the USR, as was demonstrated in the other chapter. The true, complex, contradictory, and shifting nature of Zionism's relationship with imperialism and colonialism, similar to that of many other national movements, can thus be brought into the light, affirming its status as a genuine nationalism rather than a hyper-imperialist conspiracy. National movements of both Jews and Arabs have, at various points throughout history, been both allies and opponents of competing imperialisms, British, American, Russian, and others. That fact does not give either people a, quote, imperialist or, quote, anti-imperialist essence, nor negate their basic entitlement to democratic rights. The social democrat, who claims to uphold a mainstream labor tradition from which the boogie figure of Corbyn was held to be deviating, should remember which party oversaw Britain's colonial policy at the time of Israel's foundation. As John Strawson put it, quote, many of those in the Labour Party who opposed Jeremy Corbyn's leadership lionized Clement Attlee. Corbyn has sided with Israel's military opponents such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and oversaw Labour anti-Semitism that caused Jewish members of the Labour Party great discomfort and discrimination, while poisoning political discourse. However, Corbyn was never in a position to prevent Holocaust survivors from reaching safety, to arm states waging war against the Jewish state, or to refuse to support Israel's UN membership. That was the role that Clement Attlee played. End quote. This is just a side note. That quote first is from John Strawson. As a side quote, probably the most radical left, or one of the most radical left members of the Labour Party in the 20th century, I think G.D.H. Cole was also a member, but Harold Lasky, who was definitely was a Labour Party politician, but definitely was kind of in favor, at least in certain points, of a workers' revolution in Great Britain, was Jewish and a staunch Zionist. So the tradition of a radical leftist in the UK being also a Zionist is not is also not like a complete, overturning of tradition or something like that. The existence of the State of Israel is a product of the effects of imperialism on Jews, as much, if not more than, a product of shifting colonial policies of any then existing empire. As such, the primarily culpable imperialism is Nazism, and arguably Tsarism before it. Had it not been for those acts of violent oppression, displacement, and attempted extermination, the material basis for the State of Israel, large numbers of Jews emigrating or fleeing to Palestine, convinced of the need to exercise their right to self-determination there, could not have existed. Who does not wish it otherwise? As the Polish Jewish leftist Isaac Deutscher, best known as the biographer of Trotsky, wrote, quote, "It would have been better had Israel remained unborn and the 6 million Jews stayed alive," end quote. But the history of the 20th century unfolded as it did, not as the internationalist leftist would have wished. The denial of this reality has the effect of erasing from the historical page one of the most traumatic experiences any people has ever suffered. It reduced the Holocaust to the status of a, quote, virtual fact, end quote, the occurrence of which is acknowledged, but the impact of which on subsequent events or the consciousness of those affected is denied. A politics which demands that Israel cease to exist as a precondition for any form of progress must first account for how it intends to transport us to a world in which the Holocaust did not happen. Israel's existence, and the very existence of the Israeli Jews as a national people, is so bound up with a history of persecution and genocide that a politics which insists on Israel's innate illegitimacy is almost inevitably heard by many Jews as an insensitivity to that history. When the shriller, but in some ways more honest, advocates of the anti-imperialism of fools fantasize about rerunning the war of 1948 with the outcomes reversed, what else will Jews hear but support for anti-Semitism? Many on the left seem incapable or unwilling to acknowledge the reasons why their experiences of persecution might have led many Jews to reach nationalist, statist, and even militarist conclusions about their own safety. But one way in which some on the left do connect Israel and the Holocaust is by comparing its conduct with that of the Nazis. As well as being inaccurate, these comparisons often either implicitly or explicitly claim that Jews should somehow, quote, know better, end quote, than to oppress Palestinians because of their own historic experiences of oppression. In May 2021, for example, veteran leftist Tariq Ali used his speech at the rally of a mass pro-Palestine demonstration to proclaim that Israelis, quote, had learned nothing from that happened to them in Europe. Nothing, end quote. Tariq Ali, in a separate interview, was interviewing a German leftist and said that, the German left shouldn't feel like any guilt for what their parents did. They should get over that and, be pro-Palestine, which doesn't just mean being for Tariq Ali, clearly doesn't mean just being pro-Palestine, but anti-Israel as such. As if the radical left in Germany was not absolutely laden with anti-Semitism. The two main examples would be like the failed or planned bombing of a Jewish community center on the anniversary of Kristallnacht by a German left group, the praising of the Munich massacre by Ulrike Meinhof, also the Entebbe affair, where with the aid of Palestinian commandos, hijacked a plane with the assistance of German leftists and separated the Jews or Israelis as from the non-Jews and held them hostage, threatening to kill them all if their demands weren't met. And where did they seek refuge? Entebbe, in Uganda. Idi Amin's Uganda, one of the most brutal dictators in all of African history, and a Nazi supporter, a Hitler fan. That is not neutral. That is not just pro-Palestinian. As we heard in the other name, in the earlier person, what's his name, Kunzelman, who was essentially part of the anti-authoritarian wing of the extra-parliamentary movement, said that, the German left in the early 1960s needs to get over its Jew hang-up, which is crazy. Also, something to keep in mind with that. Sorry, I don't know why I'm rambling here, but I'm going to ramble. I don't think Germany, like West Germany, recognized Israel until like 1965, or established diplomatic relations formally with Israel until like the mid 1960s, which is like a fucking bananas thing that I had no idea. Where am I? Where the hell is Tariq Ali? The idea that the experience of attempted genocide is a form of moral instruction from which one should learn certain lessons and then be held to a higher moral standard if one fails to do so is particularly obscene. Although there has been a continuous Jewish presence in historic Palestine for millennia, Jewish incomers to the territory during the 20th century were not merely immigrants seeking citizenship in some other state. Zionism was a settler nationalism rather than one that aimed to found an independent state in a territory with an existing Jewish majority population. Jewish immigrants to Palestine frequently acted as all settlers throughout history have and displaced communities already living in the territory they arrived in. But, unlike the French in Algeria and the British in India, there was no imperial metropole to which these colonists, many of them survivors of pogroms and death camps, could return. In this history, the distinction between, quote, settler and, quote, refugee is blurred. Jewish immigrants to Palestine were, in essence, both. I really like that formulation. I'm going to repeat those last couple sentences. But unlike the French in Algeria and the British in India, there was no imperial metropole to which these colonists, many of them survivors of pogroms and death camps, could return. In this history, the distinction between, quote, settler and, quote, refugee is blurred. Jewish immigrants to Palestine were, in essence, both. The origins of Zionism and the state of Israel in Jewish experiences of oppression do not justify the ethnic cleansing that took place as part of Israel's formation or the Israeli state's contemporary oppressive policies. Nor do they imply that the Palestinians must give up the struggle for their own rights because the forebears of their oppression were themselves oppressed. But a left which aims to transform consciousness cannot do so without an understanding of existing conditions. As the Palestinian writer Iyad el-Baghdadi put it, responding to an interlocutor describing Israel as the, quote, epitome of hate, end quote, quote, Israel is the epitome of hurt. You will not understand Israel without understanding how a Jewish person felt in 1945. 2/3 of all Israeli soldiers who expelled us from our homes in 1948 had either survived or fled the Holocaust just a few years earlier, end quote. The acute asymmetry of the contemporary relationship between Israel and Palestine, a heavily armed regional power with an essentially first-world economy, versus a subjugated and dispossessed people, can lead to an understandable instinct to balk at the idea that the left should have any consideration of both sides in our perspective towards the issue. Quote, we can't, quote, both sides, end quote, colonialism, end quote, the argument goes. That is true in its own terms. In the immediate situation of national oppression, the left should be on the side of the Palestinians against the oppressive power, the Israeli state, in their struggle for independence and self-determination. But this does not mean the left should be against the people of Israel and their right to self-determination in some intrinsic essential sense, to move from opposition to Israeli nationalism, chauvinism and colonialism to straightforward, quote, anti-Israelism, end quote. Opposition to Israeli policy no more necessitates opposition to Israeli Jewish self-determination than opposition to the oppression of, for example, the Tamils necessitates opposition to Sinhalese rights or the existence of Sri Lanka. When the left takes sides on the basis of the existing relationship between a state and a national group it oppresses, we are not required to extrapolate from that that the people of that state are transhistorically, quote, bad, or have given up their own entitlement to democratic rights because their state has acted oppressively. Nor are we required to endorse nationalist arguments that insist entitlement to rights derives solely from those who was in a territory first, or who has been there for longest. The construction of categories of, quote, good and, quote, bad peoples, whose status as good or bad determines whether they deserve rights, is a form of anti-materialist mysticism that belongs to a politics of national and communal chauvinism, not international socialism. For rights to be meaningful, rights must be universal. Keith Kahn Harris emphasizes the importance of this universalist rather than particularist advocacy of democratic, including national rights with reference to Palestine. Quote, pro-Palestinian campaigners understandably try and demonstrate why Palestinian society and culture is worth fighting for. Yet to make the case for Palestinian liberation in terms of the excellence of their poetry, their heroic resilience, and the worthiness of their political movement is ultimately to weaken the Palestinian cause. The corollary of such arguments is that if the Palestinians were culturally uninteresting, hate-filled extremists, they would be unworthy of liberation, which is in fact a common argument made by some defenders of Israel. End quote. Keith Kahn Harris. Rights, in other words, are not afforded on the basis of whether a group is, quote, good or, quote, bad. As Kahn Harris continues, quote, liberation is not a reward for good behavior, but a human right. This also acts as a paradoxical guarantee to Palestinians, that they will not be abandoned when they become politically inconvenient, like Palestinians in Syria have, and that if a future Palestinian state was to oppress certain kinds of people, they would not be forgotten, end quote. Kahn Harris. In its attitude to Israeli Jewish self-determination, much of the left reduces national rights to precisely the status of a, quote, reward for good behavior, end quote, to which Israeli Jews are not entitled because of the oppressive policies of their state, or the injustices perpetrated in the process of their state's foundation. The formation of a Hebrew-speaking Jewish national community in historic Palestine and the foundation of a state based on that community was both a process of settlement that displaced an existing population and a fight of oppressed people seeking refuge from persecution and attempted extermination. That flight for refuge did not include only Ashkenazi Jews fleeing Europe, but Mizrahi Jews fleeing Middle Eastern and North African countries. In the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing and displacement that took place during the 1948 war around Israel's foundation, 750,000 Palestinians fled or were driven out of their homes. In the years around the state of Israel's foundation, a similar number of Jews fled or were expelled from Arab countries. Neither reality justifies or diminishes the other. Palestinian refugees from the Nakba are not responsible for the expulsion of Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern countries any more than they are responsible for the displacement of Ashkenazi Jews from European countries. Nor is this to argue that the Nakba and the Jewish flight and expulsion from Arab countries are directly paralleled or equivalent events, but these histories confirm that both Jewish and Palestinian experience in the Middle East has involved ethnic cleansing and displacement. As Spencer Sunshine put it, quote, the important thing here is not to say, quote, Israel is not as bad as other countries, so Israel needs to be let off the hook, end quote, or is it to say, quote, since some Mizrahi Jews were expelled by Arab countries, it's okay that Palestinians were expelled in the Nakba, end quote. But the question is, quote, why is Israel on the hook when other countries are not, end quote. End quote. Spencer Sunshine. One of the things that I think is always kind of like lost in this, like a lot of this story, is that like there's this idea that it was just like Israel and then like the Palestinians in 1948. But to my understanding, Israel, as soon as after the UN partition is validated and Israel is established as a state or recognized as a state, immediately 5 other countries tried to invade it. And whereas the Israelis, the Jews, had no place to go, Arab people could go into the territories towards the territories of the invading armies. I mean, maybe I'm mistelling history here, but the idea that there was there was Israel, the Israeli state versus like the Palestinian state in 1948 kind of takes the whole picture completely out of like the international arena, international perspective, or regional perspective. I think, like, for instance, Daniel Randall's party, for instance, Alliance for Workers' Liberty, as every other Trotskyist and any other honest historian, would make a big deal out of how, like, when the USSR, or when the Soviet, after the October Revolution, it was threatened with an invasion and confrontation with 14 external armies, and that was very relevant for how the state understood itself and how it conducted itself in that period. I think that they should probably apply a similar thing to the conversation about Israel and Palestine. It's not just Israel established a state and versus the Palestinians, and the Palestinians suffered. Of course they did, and I think that's Randall's right to point that out. But it should be noted that the Palestinians are part of and the Arabs in general are part of a bigger wave of an Arab region that had an Arab national consciousness and sought to destroy Israel, back the Palestinians by destroying Israel. For me, it seems like just kind of like when you talk about like the Nakba, as if it was just like, all right, the state of Israel's established, get the fuck out. It was like, it was like there was ethnic cleansing and there was displacement, obviously, on the basis of a war that was taking place, an exterminationist war that sought to destroy an entire state, not just defeat it militarily for some purpose, but to destroy it. That has that is an extremely important consideration when talking about this topic in history. Like the idea is like, oh, Israel's established, get the hell out, Palestinians, because we're so mean. Obviously, it's not like you could say that wasn't like an idea or a factor in this. Of course it was. But you have to it's like, to get like an actually fully contextualized picture, you have to realize that there was 5 invading armies that were on the side of these people that were expelled, right? And these armies were trying to destroy Israel. It's not just like it's more complicated than just like, oh yeah, we want Jewish purity in our land, so get the fuck out. It's like, no, these Arab armies that invaded and were supported by large parts of like the Arab, or at least a decent part of like the Arab local population, that tried to destroy the state. I don't know, I think I've lost the completeness of that sentence. Anyway, maybe I'm maybe my historiography or my general gestalt of the situation is misguided in some way, but yeah. And then people say, and it's funny because they don't apply this to they don't apply this kind of they don't apply this double standard when talking about oftentimes anti-Zionists, at least, will not talk about this. Will have this kind of contextual, overarching thing when they're talking about the the expulsion of Jews from the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, which I think was about 800,000, comparable to the Nakba. They'll say, well, those people were viewed as like a fifth column of Israel, so it was really Israel's fault that these people were expelled and not the states themselves. People wouldn't say that about the Nakba, right? They wouldn't say oh yeah, these people were expelled or displaced because Arab armies that were at least ostensibly coming to their defense against Israel tried to destroy Israel, not just establish a different border regime, but effectively destroy it. I think that they wouldn't try to like make that contextualized thing about these displacements, right? So if you're going to say that, if we're going to talk about the displacements of the Nakba and the displacement of Jews in the Middle East, you have to, and you want to talk about it contextually, you should be contextual in both cases. I think a lot of people have this idea that Israel's established, everyone get the fuck out, as if it was just kind of like not a war, as if there was no war happening, or that Israel's existence wasn't extremely precarious, and it was just its hands weren't tied in any kind of capacity. Obviously, that doesn't justify it, or it doesn't say anything about the future of it, of the region. But yeah. Where am I? In other cases of ethnic cleansing and displacement in the context of wars and intercommunal violence, the left advocates a broad program of restorative measures, including reparations, repatriation, i.e. return, and demands for full equality in the countries in which refugees and exiles now live. But for the Nakba, much of the far left insists that justice is possible only via a maximal, quote, right of return, end quote, not only for the still living Palestinian refugees, but for all of their descendants, to what is now Israel. This policy belongs to a different discourse than a general adequacy of free movement and open borders, and pits the children and grandchildren of Palestinian refugees from the Nakba against the children and grandchildren of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust and expulsions from Arab countries. It also served to deflect criticism from governments such as Lebanon's and Syria's, which have denied Palestinian refugees full equality and, in Syria's case, bombed refugee camps. Amongst Palestinians themselves, the notion of, quote, return has, according to polling, a variety of meanings and applications. As with all the injustices of the history of Israel-Palestine, ultimate settlement and redress are possible only via democratic accommodation between the peoples of the region. Without question, lasting peace and justice requires Israeli acknowledgement of the Nakba and a settlement based on a meaningful material redress for its victims. Ayman Odeh, a Palestinian socialist and member of the Knesset, Israeli parliament, has written, that's an important thing right there. The very fact that there's a Palestinian socialist in the Knesset parliament says something about the content of so-called Israeli apartheid. Not that you couldn't say that there was something approaching apartheid in particular, in relation to the Gaza and the West Bank, or that in the settlements, of course, you can say something. That's something that is a more reasonable discernment to make. But concurrently, if you're talking about within Israel proper, the 20% of the population that is Arab in background does have full formal democratic rights. That doesn't mean that they aren't discriminated against, right? That doesn't mean that they're not. They don't face persecution in the society as a whole, but on the books, on the formal equality, as terms of is granted to them. That's just a side note. You couldn't imagine to say that Nelson Mandela was an active political figure in the state of apartheid South Africa would be fucking insane. So, back to the text. As Ayman Odeh, a Palestinian socialist and member of the Knesset, Israeli parliament, has written, quote, true Jewish-Arab partnership begins with mutual recognition of the rights of the two peoples, Jewish and Palestinian, to self-determination. Only through recognition and amending the historical injustice can we build together a future of justice, equality, democracy, peace, and partnership. End quote. Beautifully stated. That was a beautifully stated passage right there. Internationalists and anti-racists in Israel-Palestine have sought to develop policies that acknowledge the trauma of the Nakba and advocate meaningful redress without revanchism. The, quote, two states, one homeland, a land for all, end quote, initiative, a joint Israeli-Jewish-Palestinian campaign for a democratic and egalitarian two-state settlement, argues, quote, ignoring the Palestinian refugee question is not an option. However, one of our basic principles is that two wrongs don't make a right. Jews will not be driven out of their homes so that their original Palestinian owners may be housed in them. The wrong will be corrected in two ways. The first, refugees will receive appropriate monetary compensation. If possible, efforts will be made to rebuild towns or villages in areas that are at present unpopulated. The second, Palestinian refugees, after becoming Palestinian citizens, will have freedom of movement throughout the homeland they have been exiled from. They will be allowed to make long-term visits and work there. A certain percentage of them will receive residential rights even in the first phase, and our vision is that in the future they will all enjoy this right, but the next stages will be implemented gradually and in agreement. Seems very sensible to me. Instead of endorsing such approaches, many left groups insist on a kind of maximalism, applying to Israel policies and perspectives they have not advocated for similar situations throughout history. As the academics Zina Arnold and Blair Taylor put it, quote, state foundation and expansion are frequently accompanied by forced population transfers. Yet the demand for the right of return for Palestinians is almost exclusively directed at Israel. Although this has been a persistent sticking point holding up negotiations for Palestinian statehood, it is rarely a condition for other partition states, for example, India and Pakistan. Left discourse also seldom discusses the treatment of Palestinian refugees by other states like Syria and Egypt, or mentions the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees exiled from neighboring Arab countries in the wake of 1948. None of these examples serve as justification for Israeli crimes or any other occupation. Rather, the lack of attention and activism around them illustrates a profound double standard operating within left political discourse, one that happens to resonate with historical patterns of anti-Semitic exceptionalism. End quote. Zina Arnold and Blair Taylor. And if you don't know who Zina Arnold is, maybe I've said this in other things because these people have been. Zina Arnold is a leftist from Germany who works at some kind of anti-Semitism initiative in Germany now. I think that's what she does. But she wrote a big book on anti-Semitism in the American left, which is kind of like an empirical study of attitudes to the question of Jews and Israel on the part of participants in the radical left in the United States, which, I think its conclusions are not that the left in the United States is anti-Semitic, but there's some pretty serious confusion about what even anti-Semitism is, and a kind of failure to address where, a failure to acknowledge when anti-Semitism rears its head if it's not explicitly saying something bad about the Jews. I think that's what the fundamental conclusions of the book are, which I haven't read. Which was, if you're curious, was translated by Jacob Blumenfeld, or Jacob Bloomfeld. I can't remember if there's an E-N in his name. I think it's Jacob Blumenfeld. But he wrote a big fat book on Max Stirner, and I think is right, it comes from a radical communist left perspective. And has translated a lot of the books the essays that were in the compendium, Sage Hand's book of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. Blair Taylor, as I've said before, he has a few pieces on this channel that I've read from him, but he was the president of the Social Ecology, Institute for Social Ecology, which was the institute, if you don't know socioecology, it's a kind of a tendency within radical left politics around the anarchist Murray Bookchin. So, these are people with very serious left-wing credentials, and anti-fascist credentials. New section: Israeli Jewish national self-determination, a racist endeavor? The argument that Israel's very existence, rather than any particular act or policy, is essentially racist and should, by implication, therefore be undone, was the political substance underlying much of the largely unedifying debate over the Labour Party's endorsement of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's, quote, working definition of anti-Semitism, end quote, which generated a great deal more heat than light. Much of the opposition to endorsement has focused on one particular example in that guidance, that, quote, claiming a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, end quote, could, quote, taking into account the overall context, end quote, be an example of anti-Semitism. Agreeing with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's agreeing with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on this point does not preclude description of Israeli policies as, quote, racist. It does not even preclude description of the, i.e., current existing, quote, state of Israel, end quote, as, quote, a racist endeavor, end quote. It merely suggests that arguing that, quote, a state of Israel, that is, any state of Israel, any expression at the level of statehood, of Israeli Jewish national self-determination is necessarily, automatically, quote, a racist endeavor, end quote, could be anti-Semitic. Could be anti-Semitic. And yet a great deal of leftist energy in Labour Party circles has been expended in furious opposition to this clause, demanding the right to denounce Israel as, quote, a racist endeavor, end quote, without ever having to think through the implications of the claim or acknowledge that it could, in the context of certain critiques, imply anti-Semitism. Israel has racist policies, not only that of occupation in Palestinian territories, but via discrimination against the Palestinian minority within Israel itself. The right to describe those policies as such, the right to name the injustices committed in the process of Israel's foundation as ethnic cleansing, and the right to critique exclusionary and chauvinist conceptions of Israeli nationhood must be protected as matters of free speech. The debate that means resisting attempts to use IRA guidance to close down debate about Israel-Palestine and to turn it from its original intention, guidance, into a statutory code of conduct used to criminalize speech. But the broader argument here is more than semantic hair-splitting over definite and indefinite articles. The claim that any expression of the Israeli Jewish national self-determination is necessarily a, quote, racist endeavor, end quote, implies there is some racist essence to Israeli Jewish nationhood that exists in abstraction from any concrete racist policy a state of Israel may pursue or constitutional form it might take. Tony Greenstein, a left-wing activist and prominent denier of even the possibility, let alone the existence, of left anti-Semitism, has said of Israel, quote, there are many repressive states in the world, but there is only one racist state. There is only one apartheid state, end quote. This statement succinctly encapsulates the claim, key to left anti-Semitism, that Israel is a unique and singular expression of racism at the level of a nation-state. The logical extension is that the vast majority of Jews internationally, who have some level of affinity with Israel, however diffuse or critical, must also therefore be tainted by or complicit in that unique and singular form of racism. This claim of an innate, essential illegitimacy is not a claim the far left generally makes of other national groups, even those whose states have colonized or oppressed other peoples. One preferred justification for this apparent discrepancy is that the Israeli Jews are not, in fact, a national group that should, like all other national groups, be entitled to national self-determination. They are a settler caste, equivalent to whites in apartheid South Africa, by which any expression of self-determination is necessarily racist and exclusionary. Israel's occupation regime shares many operational features of South African apartheid, and the Palestinian minority inside Israel itself faces intense discrimination. Some human rights groups have argued that Israel's policies meet international legal definitions of, quote, apartheid, given that Despite notional Palestinian self-rule, Israel is the de facto ruling power over an entire territory within which people are formally discriminated against on the basis of their ethnic or national origin. I would question the extent to which Hamas doesn't really rule Gaza. But that's just me. Some human rights groups have argued that Israel's policies meet international legal definitions of, quote, apartheid, given that, despite notional Palestinian self-rule, Israel is the de facto ruling power over an entire territory within which people are formally discriminated against on the basis of their ethnic or national origin. But on the left, a much more general equivalence between Israel and apartheid South Africa, between Israeli Jews and white South Africans, has frequently been drawn. That equivalence obscures important differences between the two situations. South African apartheid was a particular social form. The white South Africans were relatively economically homogeneous and a small minority group, around 13% at the time of the fall of apartheid, whose rule relied on the exploitation of the labor of the black majority. Israeli Jews, by contrast, are a fully class-differentiated populace, not a narrow caste, and although many Palestinians work in Israel, the Israeli economy has never relied solely on the exploitation of a Palestinian majority in the way apartheid rests on the backs of black workers. Indeed, the early Israeli economy was based on an exclusion of Arab labor rather than an exploitation of Arab labor, an exclusion that was, shamefully, actively facilitated by the mainstream Israeli labor movement. A white South African, quote, nation could not have survived without the exploitation of black labor. Therefore, any notion of a distinct form of self-determination for white South Africans as white South Africans was indeed necessarily racist. But in Israel that surrendered its occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, recognized an independent Palestinian state, and granted full civil rights and equality to the Palestinian minority within its own borders, would still be a viable national entity. The implied democratic solution to South African apartheid was to smash the apartheid state and institute a democratic system based on equal rights between black and white South Africans. But a democratic solution based on equal rights in a situation where there are two distinct national groups, both with a strong will to self-determine, as opposed to a majority community exploited by a minority caste, must involve equal national rights, up to and including the right to an independent state. It should be noted that there are left traditions that reject the principle of national self-determination altogether and view demands for independent national statehood as reactionary endeavors that obstruct or divert class struggle. Consistent adherents to these traditions oppose all national claims equally, seeing them as inherently nationalist and viewing anything other than worker struggles to overthrow capitalism as a blind alley. One second, I want to see this, if I can find the citation here. See, for example, Fabio Daman, The Palestinian Tragedy, Communist Workers Organization, undated, available at leftcom.org. One tendency even summarizes its position as, quote, neither Israel nor Palestine, end quote. This perspective, which does not make an exception of Israeli Jewish nationhood and sees demands for Palestinian statehood as equally distracting from the need to build revolutionary working class consciousness, is not logically anti-Semitic, but these traditions are highly minoritarian, and none of the most prominent tendencies on the left that stridently oppose Israel Jewish national rights belong to them. Yeah, that's true, right? I think that's actually a very fair estimation on the part of Randall, in my opinion. Like, it seems like there definitely is a difference between different lefts that critique anti-Zionism. For instance, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty definitely kind of comes from, because they're a Trotskyist organization and thus a Leninist organization, they definitely have a view of the like a Leninist view of like the right of nations to self-determination, with many of the problems that entails. But like for instance, like the anti-Deutsch or the anti-nationalist left in Germany, and also the Institute for Social Ecology people, they're more critical, and as well as people that are from Alliance for Workers' Liberty. For instance, Philip Spencer, I think, might have been part of Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and Robert Fine. I mean, so it's like not like a firm rule, but it's these people are way more questioning of the whole notion of right to self-determination of nations in general, and especially like the curtailment of particular self-determinations, whether they be human, just in general human self-determination, the self-determination of the direct producers, or the self-determination of minorities in those countries. Like national self-determination bucks against a lot of other self-determinations. And I think that Randall would agree with that. I think that a lot of people in the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, but they still kind of like, there's a difference between like I guess people would say that, okay, Israel has a right to exist amongst the community of nation states because nation states are part of like the are somehow like a key component of a democratic order, right? So like some like social democratic people, like I think Michael Walzer, who's kind of some kind of like communitarian liberal left guy, he and I suppose, what's his name, Mitchell Cohen, maybe they won't be, but they're kind of a little bit more like view positively the nation state as like a democratic form. And I suppose Alliance for Workers' Liberty would kind of be sympathetic to that viewpoint. But then there's others that are full just like anti-nationalists. And I think these kind of like people, these full-blooded anti-nationalists that are being like that were just alluded to by Randall, would have a different conception of the issue. And this, I feel like that's kind of like a problem with like, just like left communism in general. And I think a lot of other communisms, like they don't really see, like when you take like an anti-nationalist stance, which I am very much, I would consider myself in that tradition. I think that every move towards, I'll be very cautious about national identities, oppressed ones or not, Jewish or non-Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, anything like that. But a lot of those people like think that it's just a matter of indifference how different states, the policies that different states uphold regarding each other, right? So some people would be like, who gives a shit about like Ukrainian self-determination? Who gives a shit about the Ukrainian nation state, like it, or the Russian nation state? Like they're all just nation states, so like to hell with all of them. As if like when one nation state violates the national integrity of another nation state, there isn't like wrapped up into that whole project a radical decimation of the self-determination of human beings and the classes that they belong to, like the working class, for instance. Like I don't think the invasion of Ukraine has done wonders for the class struggle in Ukraine. So just kind of having this kind of like shame on both your houses, fuck the nation state kind of thing, is usually kind of just paints with too broad a brush. when you're talking about like geopolitical questions, right? Even though I am fundamentally in sympathy with their analysis, right? I'm fundamentally in sympathy with hostility to the nation state, but or like in hostility to nationalist identities, as such. Generally or universally across the board, I'm way more sympathetic with that as would be like Rosa Luxemburg. But I don't think that really is sufficient for global analysis, especially when the world of the nation state is a reality, right? Like, if the abolition of the nation state was some kind of imminent reality that was, just around the corner, if only like, then that might be different, right? Or if there's in a situation of upheaval, if there was, say, for instance, like a general class mobilization on either side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they could come together and create some unified body of unified state, then that would be one thing. But I don't see that happening at all, and people are dying. So I don't really think that like these kind of like abstract enunciations of nationalism as such, which again I agree with, are very helpful, right? Anyway, new section, boycott Israel, ? The aforementioned comparison with apartheid South Africa is what gives the demand to boycott Israel, now dominant across much left-wing and even liberal opinion, its emotional power and apparent logic. If Israel is the contemporary equivalent of South Africa, it can only be right to isolate and boycott it, as part of an ultimate effort to get rid of it. But if the Israeli Jews are a national group, rather than a racial supremacist minority caste, then the Jewish working class, the internationalist and anti-racist forces within Israeli society, have progressive potential, and not merely in the sense that courageous white South African supporters of black struggle were progressive, but in the sense of being an agency for transformative change within a distinct national group. They should be made a focus for support and solidarity, not opposed as part of an allegedly illegitimate people, lumped in with their own ruling class, or sacrificed as the acceptable collateral damage of a root and branch boycott policy. Certain targeted boycotts of particular companies have their place in the tactical arsenal of international solidarity movements. Some campaigners advocate targeted boycotts of produce from settlements, the direct opposite of Israeli colonialism. The direct outposts of Israeli colonialism. I was like, what the fuck? That didn't make sense. Those are matters of tactical assessment. A different premise entirely from making a comprehensive boycott policy, what Edward Said called a, quote, unselective boycott of even the name, quote, Israel, end quote, a non-negotiable political starting point of solidarity. Palestinian socialist Maysam Jaljouli wrote of her struggles in the left-wing movement Omdim Be Yahad, Standing Together, which organizes Israeli Jews alongside Arabs. Quote, we're affected by BDS, bracket, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, end bracket, movements, which tell people it's wrong to make direct links with anyone in Israel, which, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, really makes me sad. We're the people on the ground who are fighting the right wing in Israel, who are opposing the occupation, It is a shame when people refuse to acknowledge us and stand in solidarity with our struggles." End quote. The multinational orchestra, including both Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Arab musicians, which Edward Said co-founded with Israeli musician Daniel Barenboim, has also been targeted by BDS activists. The strong Palestinian support for BDS as the baseline political stance towards Israel is understandable. Neither armed uprising nor diplomatic negotiation has moved the Palestinians much closer to meaningful equality and statehood. BDS provides a clear formula for international supporters of Palestinian rights to take action against Israel. Attempts by various governmental authorities and public bodies, now underway in several countries, to censor and criminalize advocacy of BDS are grave affronts to free speech that must be resisted. But defending the right to advocate BDS also means that defending the right to, quote, to contest, quote, boycott Israel, end quote, as a politically and strategically useful starting point. Demands for sanctions such as arms embargoes, a policy which the left absolutely should advocate, must be separated from a blanket boycott stance. Here, too, the left makes an exception of Israel. No socialist group proposes, quote, boycott China, end quote, as a response to China's oppression of the Uyghurs or its occupation of Tibet. Perhaps in part because some on the left have yet to accept the reality of those oppressions, and no group proposes, quote, boycott India, end quote, as a necessary response to Modi and Hindutva. While some Kurdish solidarity groups have proposed a, quote, boycott Turkey, end quote, strategy, this has gained little traction on the left. The contradictions were neatly illustrated by a November 2020 tweet from Jewish Voice for Labor, a group set up to deny and downplay allegations of left anti-Semitism, which said, quote, if you want to celebrate, bracket, the Jewish festival, end bracket, Hanukkah, and support BDS, these candles are made in China. We can't certify the working conditions, unfortunately, end quote. My intent here is not to argue for the expansion of boycotts, rather the reverse. In the case of Turkey, India, and China, a boycott strategy would counterproductively refocus activity away from practical solidarity with labor movement, left-wing and democratic forces resisting oppression, and towards the pursuit of an impossible ethical consumption. It would also make Chinese, Indian, and Turkish communities in Britain, who are themselves victims of racism, and for whom boycotting China, India, and Turkey would be simply inoperable, objects of suspicion and hostility because of their links to the country targeted for boycott and isolation. Similarly, making a comprehensive boycott of Israel and the breaking of any and all links with Israel, a precondition of support for the rights of the Palestinians, creates an unnecessary and artificial political test that the vast majority of the world's Jews will almost automatically fail, and therefore risk turning, quote, boycott Israel, end quote, efforts into campaigns that target Jews. Socialist internationalists might well look forward to a future when a clear separation can be drawn between the Israeli Jewish nation and diaspora Jewish communities, but the diffuse cultural affinity most Jews undeniably feel for Israel cannot be overcome at will. If the left tells Jews that Israel, flight to which might have been the difference between the members of their own family survival and their murder, but not other states that practice similar policies of national oppression, must be boycotted and isolated, that is far more likely to reinforce nationalist consciousness than help dismantle it. Some on the left argue that, because BDS is the majority policy of the Palestinian national movement, it is somehow anti-democratic or even an act of, quote, scabbing, end quote, to oppose it. But supporting a national liberation movement's democratic goals, such as independent statehood, does not compel socialists to support every policy or strategy orientation that movement adopts. Indeed, given that the majority formal policy of the Palestinian Liberation Organization has, since 1993, been for a two-state settlement, Any leftist advocating a one-state solution already implicitly accepts the right to dissent from particular policies that a given national liberation movement supports. In 2006, a proposed motion at a conference of the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education, NATFHE, now part of the University and College Union, called for a boycott of all Israeli individuals and institutions, quote, that do not publicly dissociate themselves from, end quote, Israeli policy. Steve Cohen wrote in response, quote, the issue here is loyalty tests. It is being forced into making an open and public political statement, not out of principle, but out of blackmail, ... The NATFHE resolution refers to boycotts of individuals and institutions, with the loyalty test applying to both. The Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACBI, has said in support of the boycott, quote, no Israeli academic body or institution has ever taken a public stand against the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, end quote. This, I'm sure, is true. But it is equally true that in the UK, no academic body has taken a stand against the institutionalized racism of immigration control. Why does the NATFHE, the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education, campaign for a boycott, not a loyalty test, against UK college institutions for compliance with such racism? In reality, NATFHE, the National Association of Teachers of Further and Higher Education, has for years been accepting the loyalty test set by UK colleges and universities. Quote, are you or have you ever been of full immigration status, end quote. It would be interesting to know if NATFHE, as an employer, demeans itself by complying with immigration legislation which incidentally would prevent it employing Palestinian asylum seekers fleeing Israeli repression. Perhaps the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education should start boycotting itself, end quote. Steve Cohen, author of That's Funny, You Don't Look Anti-Semitic. The anti-Semitic potential of the, quote, boycott Israel, end quote, default is further illustrated by the specific historic focus on much such activity in Britain on Marks and Spencer, M&S, which has been regularly picketed by the Revolutionary Communist Group and others. Marks and Spencer sells some Israeli produce, like every other retailer of its type, and has commercial operations in Israel, like almost every major high street corporation. The particular focus on Marks and Spencer originates in the fact that Marks and Spencer's former chairman, Israel Saif, was a prominent Zionist. Michael Marks, one of the co-founders of Marks and Spencer, was Jewish, and his son Simon appointed CF, a childhood friend and business associate, as chairman. CF has been dead since 1972. Simon Marks since 1964. Michael Marks since 1907. But these historic associations are enough to make Marks and Spencer's a target. Marks and Spencer a target. Even though, since 2008, Marks and Spencer has explicitly refused to stock goods from occupied Palestinian territories. In a Revolutionary Communist Group article justifying Marks and Spencer as a target for, quote, boycott Israel, end quote, agitation, no event later than 1972 is cited as justification for the focus on Marks and Spencer. No explanation is given as to how boycotting Marks and Spencer will make any contribution towards any material improvement in conditions of life for the Palestinians, or exert any pressure on the Israeli government, to which Michael and Spencer has no links. Marks and Spencer has no links. Sorry, I'm not from the UK. Assuming that's some kind of grocery store that's important and that's big in. I wonder what its affiliate in the United States might be. Maybe it doesn't have one. I think in the United States we have Aldi, which I think is German in origin. But I don't know if we have any grocery stores, widespread grocery store chains that are English affiliated. But I'm not sure. And if the only qualification necessary to be a target of this agitation is, quote, historical support for Zionism, end quote, then that too is a net wide enough to catch almost all Jews alive. Let me repeat that. And if the only qualification necessary to be a target for this agitation is, quote, historical support for Zionism, end quote, then that too is a net wide enough to catch almost all Jews alive. New section on anti-Zionism. The far left has not in general felt it necessary to express its opposition to specific nationalisms via a discrete political label, still less one that is made a general point of departure in the way much of the left now does with, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote. As Martin Thomas puts it, quote, this implies that there is some political force in the world, quote, Zionism, which is such a great and compact power that just to be, quote, anti says enough to outline a whole political program. All the, quote, Zionists, from the young idealist, getting herself or himself arrested for street protests against Israel's recent killings on the Gaza border, to the foulest Israeli chauvinist, to the Jew who does no more than refuse to commit to hating Israel, are bundled together as components of that great and compact power, end quote. Using anti-Zionism as a general political label, implying that there is some way to make an anti-Zionist approach to all politics, including those unconnected to the national question in Israel-Palestine, has an unavoidable anti-Semitic logic. It inflates Jewish nationalism specifically to the status of a world-shaping power, a status it has only ever held in the anti-Semitic imagination. Zionism has been heterogeneous since Zionism's emergence as an organization in the late 19th century. Its various wings were united by the common belief that the Jews constituted a national people which should self-determine in a national home, and, later, that the national home should be in Palestine. The contemporary far left understood Zionism, broadly, as a Jewish expression of the equivalent forms of nationalism emerging amongst numerous national and proto-national peoples, politically homogenized by bourgeois elements that aim to establish a capitalist nation-state, but arising from genuine social grievances on the part of an oppressed people. Different strands within the socialist movement took different attitudes to the possibility and desirability of national self-determination, with some, including the General Jewish Labor Bund, known simply as the Bund, arguing that Jews should aspire to cultural autonomy rather than national statehood, and others, while opposing anti-Semitism and supporting Jewish rights, advocated a form of integrationism that they believed would, in time, resolve the Jewish question. Early on, Zionism developed a far left wing, shaped by Poal Zion, an explicitly Marxist party founded in 1897, which would itself undergo a number of splits along broadly left-right lines. That was earlier when I was talking about Harold Lasky. This is the brand of Zionism that he associated with. Poal Zion's theorists saw the oppression of Jews as inherent to capitalism, and therefore viewed the struggle for independent Jewish nationhood and the struggle for socialism as fused. Poal Zion members organized detachments to fight in the Bolshevik Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and the left wing of Poal Zion sought affiliation with the Bolshevik-led Third International. Poal Zion supporters staffed a Bureau of Jewish Affairs, effectively a unit of the civil service that advised the Bolshevik government on issues affecting Jews, along with supporters of the Bund. Pretty sure the Bund was, along with all other political parties, was outlawed in the Soviet Union. Not sure about the finer details, but that does come to be the case. If there's not even left socialist revolutionaries or anarchists that are allowed to engage in open political activity, what does that mean about these Zionist parties? In 1934, Zion supporters in Palestine advocated, quote, Jewish-Arab workers' solidarity, end quote, and argued, quote, there is no place, for those who are an enemy of Arab workers and their advancement in this land. We aim to forge in the land an anti-fascist force against all forms of fascism and chauvinism among the Jewish and Arab publics. We provide brotherly help to victims of fascism and anti-Semitism, end quote. Today, JLM is connected via distant political genealogy to Pal Zion. JLM was founded in 1902 as a British section of Pal Zion, which affiliated to the Labour Party in 1920. So again, the Harold Lasky connection. There were also binationalist tendencies within Zionism, which advocated a unitary Jewish-Arab state or confederal models rather than an independent Jewish state. Zionism also developed a far right coalescing from the 1920s around Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was sympathetic to Mussolini, who advocated an aggressively national chauvinist policy towards Arabs. Partisans of this wing of Zionism committed brutal massacres against Arab communities. Zionists from across the political spectrum were involved in displacement of Arab communities and the exclusion of Arab labor from the new society they built. But for increasing numbers of Jews throughout the 20th century, and especially following the rise of Nazism, Zionism appeared as an ideology of national liberation. The only apparent solution to generations of persecution and oppression. For many others, particularly during and after the Second World War, whether or not they were ideologically convinced nationalists, emigration to Palestine seemed the only way to bid for safety in a world that had witnessed their slaughter, then frequently closed its doors in their face. Again, these weren't just people that were just sitting around saying, you know what, it would be better for us to, as Jews to move to Palestine. This was in a context of extreme displacement of persons due to World War II, which is fundamentally unimaginable in terms of how severe this dislocation was, and how cities that people lived in, the entire non-Jewish population may in certain circumstances have turned on them, as often they did in Eastern Europe. Anyway, in 1954, Isaac Deutscher encapsulated this feeling, quote, for the remnants of European Jewry, for the remnants of European Jewry, is it only for them, end parenthesis. The Jewish state has become a historic necessity. It is also a living reality, ... From a burning or sinking ship, people jump no matter where, onto a lifeboat, a raft, or a float. The jumping is for them a historic necessity, and the raft is, in a sense, the basis of their, quote, their whole existence, end quote. Isaac Deutscher. The far left of prior generations, closer to the lived experience of the Holocaust, understood this better. As the U.S. socialist writer Barry Finger puts it, it was a left, quote, rooted in the intellectual shadow of pre- and post-Holocaust immediacy, where no one, ... denied the elemental legitimacy of the Israeli state, end quote. As mentioned in Chapter 4, no prominent tendency on the international far left supported the victory of the Arab armies in the 1948 war. It was understood. Now, why is this war not being talked about? I don't know why he didn't talk about this war earlier, like when I was bitching and moaning about the contents of the Nakba being a war, not just sheerly the realization of a state on a map by border-setting authorities, but an actual war between Arab countries and the Jewish state. I don't know why I didn't mention this earlier, but anyway, As mentioned in Chapter 4, no prominent tendency on the international left supported the victory of the Arab armies in the 1948 war. It was understood that the overrunning of the fledgling Jewish nation by an alliance between Arab quasi-feudalism and British colonialism would be a reactionary outcome, and not in the interest of the poor and working classes of either the Arab or the Jewish nations. The Revolutionary Communist League, the small Trotskyist group in Palestine, denounced what it saw as the Arab League's, quote, racial war against the Jews of Palestine, end quote. Although they opposed partition, i.e. the creation of separate Arab and Jewish states, they supported, quote, full national minority rights for the Jewish community, end quote, accepting the Jewish presence in Palestine as legitimate and deserving of rights. The National Liberation League, a Palestinian Arab communist, i.e. Stalinist party that emerged from a 1943 split along communal lines in the Palestine Communist Party, also supported mutual national rights and in fact explicitly advocated partition. I think that's a very important thing to look up, is look up the Arab forces that favored partition. I don't really know much about that, but that's something I would like to know more about. Although this was in part because of its loyalty to the dictates of Moscow, according to the academic Musa Budiri, in his study of the Palestinian Communist movement, quote, the same reasons adduced for the adoption of this new line could have been made convincingly a number of years earlier and would have followed quite consistently from the NLL, the National Liberation League's, characterization of the situation, end quote. This makes clear that opposition to Israeli Jewish national rights and insistence on the incompatibility of Israeli Jewish self-determination was Palestinian Arab self-determination. This makes clear that opposition to Israeli Jewish national rights and insistence on the incompatibility of Israeli Jewish self-determination with Palestinian Arab self-determination has by no means been the unquestioned position amongst left organizations, including left organizations in Palestine. Much of the far left now categorizes Zionism as a subset of white supremacist European colonialism. Although all analogies are limited, a better parallel for Zionism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is with tendencies within black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, a parallel noted by several black radicals. In 1919, the American sociologist and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois said, quote, the African movement means to us what the Zionist movement must mean to Jews, end quote. W.E.B. Du Bois. Much later, the Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver, who, by the way, is a crank and also became a Reaganite, wrote, quote, the parallel between the situation of the Jews at the time of the coming of Theodore Herzl and the present situation of black people in America is fascinating. The Jews had no homeland and were dispersed around the world, cooped up in the ghettos of Europe. Functionally, a return to Israel seemed as impractical as obtaining a homeland for Afro-Americans now seems. ... The facts of history show that the Jews are able to do precisely the same thing that Afro-Americans must now do, end quote. The academic Brian Klug expressed the contradictory dualities of Zionism, the blurring of categories of refugee and settler, and then he wrote, quote, Zionism belongs to two opposite histories at one and the same time. On the one side, it saw itself as a movement for self-determination by or on behalf of the Jews, the, quote, inside outsiders, end quote, of Europe, a people with a long history of persecution. On the other side, Zionism was itself part of a European expansion into non-European territory. Zionism spoke the language of colonization, but for the sake of emancipation, not empire. Seen from this side, Zionism historically was a flight from Europe, not an extension of the European homeland. But seen from the other side, the Jews who came as settlers were Europeans by any other name. And they were. They were both. They were Jewish as distinct from European, and European as distinct from Arab. As Klug goes on to say, when the left promotes historical narratives insensitive to these dualities, and, quote, simply folds the Jewish story into a larger narrative of Western imperialism, end quote, then, quote, Jews, whether Zionist or not, are liable to feel marginalized and excluded all over again. It is understandable that this feels like anti-Semitism, even when it isn't, end quote. Brian Klug. As Spencer Sunshine points out, if those sections of the left insisting that, quote, Zionism is racism, end quote, and a form of white supremacism, were serious about the implications of those arguments, they would argue for the left to treat almost all mainstream Jewish communal organizations, which are all, to some degree, quote, Zionist, the way the left would treat the National Front or the Ku Klux Klan. Quote, the left accepts violence against fascists, so, following its logic, if Zionism is white supremacy, why aren't leftists burning down synagogues and attacking most Jews, ... Either Zionism should be treated like any other form of white supremacist politic, or it should not be described this way at all, end quote. Spencer Sunshine. This is not to endorse the claim that, quote, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, end quote, or to argue that any expression of support for Israel or any form of Zionism must simply be excused or justified as an inevitable product of Jewish experience. Like any nationalism, when elevated to the level of military and state policy, Zionism has had oppressive consequences for other peoples. For Palestinian Arabs, Zionism is a nationalism of their oppressor, the ideological impulse behind their dispossession and colonization. Whether or not individual Zionists have been conscious racists, as some certainly have, and others clearly have not, Zionist policy has frequently been racist in its effects. Thus, like Jewish Zionism, Palestinian anti-Zionism has to be understood in the context of the historic experiences that have generated and shaped it. In another parable of Isaac Deutscher's, Jewish settlement in Palestine was described as the act of a man leaping from a burning building and landing on someone in the street below, breaking their arms and legs. If the one who leapt, quote, behaved rationally, end quote, Deutscher wrote, quote, they, having recovered, would have tried to help and console the other sufferer, and the latter might have realized that they were the victim of circumstances which neither of them had control, end quote. Instead, the one who leapt brutalizes the one onto whom they fell, quote, insults them, kicks them, and beats them up whenever they meet. The kicked person again swears revenge and is again punched and punished, end quote. Isaac Deutscher. We do not need to draw crude equations between experiences or reap the claim that Israeli policy toward the Palestinians mirrors or is based on Nazi policy towards the Jews to see that, just as historic anti-Semitism became a fertile ground for Jewish nationalism, so the historic and ongoing treatment of the Palestinians by Israel is also fertile ground for nationalism. Although he was addressing Palestinian and wider Arab national sentiment rather than the socialist left, leftists should learn from the spirit of radical egalitarian humanism that informed Edward Said when he wrote, quote, in our situation as Arabs, it has been a stupid and wasteful policy for so many years to use phrases like, quote, the Zionist entity, end quote, and completely refuse to understand and analyze Israel and Israelis on the grounds that their existence must be denied because they cause the Palestinian Nakba. History is a dynamic thing, and if we expect Israeli Jews not to use the Holocaust to justify appalling human rights abuses of the Palestinian people, we too have to go beyond such idiocies as saying that the Holocaust never took place and that Israelis are all man, woman, and child, doomed to our eternal enmity and hostility. Nothing historical is frozen in time. Nothing in history is immune to change. Nothing in history is beyond reason, beyond understanding, beyond analysis and influence, ... There must always be room for dissent, for alternative views, for ways and possibilities to challenge the tyranny of the majority, and at the same time, and most important, to advance human enlightenment and liberty. End quote. Edward Said. An understanding of history as a, quote, dynamic thing, end quote, capable of having contradictory effects on consciousness, must be consistent, applied to all communities, and reject the idea that any national people is transhistorically good or bad. It is only by understanding Zionism as containing both racist and anti-racist impulses that we can arrive at a comprehensive understanding of it, which avoids insensitivities to Jewish history that will, in Klug's phrase, quote, feel like anti-Semitism, end quote, whether or not anti-Jewish bigotry is consciously intended. It is only such an understanding that can provide the basis for a worked-out socialist perspective, a perspective that must be, quote, that must be both, quote, for Zionism in Deutscher sense and against Zionism, opposing all national oppression and chauvinism on the basis of a consistent internationalism. New section, Anti-Zionist Zionism. How then to fulfill these apparently contradictory requirements? Labor Party members were treated to a real-time effort to respond to some of these complexities in February 2020, when candidates for the party leadership were asked at a hustings organized by the Jewish labor movement if they were Zionists. Lisa Nandy, Rebecca Long Bailey, and Emily Thornberry said they were. Keir Starmer said that while, quote, sympathetic to Zionism, he wasn't a Zionist himself. In the context of the left's debates on both Israel-Palestine and anti-Semitism, it was positive that the candidates gave clear statements of support for Israeli Jews' right to self-determination. None of them was a supporter of Israel's policies. Lisa Nandy, whom JLM subsequently nominated, chairs Labor Friends of Palestine, and both Starmer and Thornberry had spoken at Palestinian Solidarity Campaign events. Their answers showed, then, that support for Israeli Jewish rights, or even self-identification as, quote, Zionist, does not make one a supporter of the occupation. For Rebecca Long Bailey, widely acknowledged as the, quote, left candidate, end quote, in the election and supported by the outgoing Corbyn leadership, to proclaim herself a, quote, Zionist, made it harder, if only momentarily, for the left to claim that Zionists were akin to racist or fascist, or that Zionists should be no-platformed or driven out of the labor movement and left spaces. But by proclaiming themselves Zionists, Nandy, Long Bailey, and Thornberry did more than express support for the right of Israeli Jews to self-determination. They explicitly aligned themselves with a form of nationalism, one that has historically been and continues to be associated with severe injustice. Had the candidates brushed up on their koan before commencing the debate, they might have been able to answer the question with more nuance. And, while it should have represented a challenge to most Jewish labor movement members, I think that's what JLM stands for, I'm not sure. JLM members in the audience, it is one they would hopefully have been familiar with, as they would all have received a complimentary copy of That's Funny, distributed by JLM itself only a few months previously. Steve Cohen gave us the way out of this apparently intractable problem with his conception of, quote, anti-Zionist Zionism, end quote. When Cohen wrote That's Funny, he said, quote, the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is absolute. Methodologically, there is no question of anti-Zionism, quote, merging into, end quote, or, quote, becoming, end quote, anti-Semitism, end quote. But later in Steve Cohen's life, he acknowledged that there had indeed been a process of, quote, merging. In 2007, Steve Cohen wrote, quote, "Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism should and could be distinct, yet they have in many respects merged, ... The immediate political task is to separate them," end quote. He began writing of himself as a, quote, "Anti-Zionist Zionist," end quote, from 2005 as a provocative way of challenging this, quote, merging, and used the description in an introductory essay for the 2005 republication of That's Funny, which was reprinted in the 2019 edition. My usage of the label, like Cohen's, is ironic and provocative, not a straight-faced descriptor for my politics. I do not demand that all Jews immediately declare themselves anti-Zionist, nor that Palestinians embrace Zionism. I do not propose that anyone on the left launches the, quote, League for Anti-Zionist Zionism, end quote, or emblazons, quote, both for and against Zionism, end quote, on a banner to take on a demonstration, although doing so would undoubtedly, quote, confuse the bastards, end quote, to use Cohen's phrase. I wonder how Daniel would feel about the concept of anti-Zionism. I suppose as like a slogan, it would just be a curious thing. While there are good reasons for avoiding the term anti-Zionist as a political point of departure, consistently democratic socialist internationalism is unavoidably anti-Zionist in the literal sense of opposing Zionist ideology in the context of a consistent opposition to nationalism. My use throughout this book of the phrase, quote, absolute anti-Zionism, end quote, as a shorthand for the policy perspective of left anti-Semitism towards Israel-Palestine, is not an argument that the left should not oppose Zionism. It is an argument that for socialists, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote, cannot be an unqualified political label, implying a historically rigid attitude to Israel's self-determination. Socialist opposition to Zionism should be contextualized by sensitivity to its historical origins, i.e. the reality of the oppression that impelled its growth, and should support the leveling up of rights between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs as the democratic alternative to Zionism. I mean, I get that he's using this as a joke, but the thought that I'm having right now while I'm reading this is I'm thinking of how, like, if Zionism is Jewish nationalism, right? And then you support the existence of the nation state, which is, in a sense, what Zionism is the support of the existence of Israel. Then, like, whether or not you call yourself a Zionist, you're accepting Zionism by default. Right? Like, and it's like almost to the point of it being like meaningless to even say you're an anti-Zionist, right? Like, if you believe that, like, I don't know, maybe I'm not thinking this through correctly, but like someone who supports the existence of, like, the the existence of Britain, or say France, as a nation state is automatically a French nationalist, right? Or are they not? You know, like, to what degree supporting the existence of a nation state is by de facto, just by default, is a nationalism, right? So I feel like if you say that you support the existence of Israel as a state, if you support the two-state solution, you are a Zionist, which I guess is why it says anti-Zionist Zionism. So you're kind of like, I don't know. It seems like what you might actually be doing is you're not being anti-Zionist at all. You're just endorsing a particular form of Zionism, which would include a Zionism of perhaps, you know, which I think is a useful conception of thinking about it, is like when you talk about, you know, in like history and talk, right, you talk about like certain nationalist groups wanting like a greater Germany, so that was like the impulse for like the Anschluss, right, when the Nazi Germany annexed pretty consensually Austria, or when people talk about greater Serbia or whatever, like including all these, which is kind of like the motivation for like a lot of the atrocities in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, right? That's that's a form of Serbia, like the greater Serbian, say for instance, greater Serbia, right? That would be a form of like Serbian nationalism, right? An extreme form of Serbian nationalism, a chauvinistic, exclusionary form of Serbian nationalism. But if you just say Serbia should exist, right? I feel like that's also a form of Serbian nationalism, just acknowledging that the boundaries of what Serbia would be are smaller than what total like expansionist Serbian nationalism would be, right? So Zionism, if you're talking about this in the case of Zionism, I feel like what it would be is just like, I know he's using it as a joke, and it's not really supposed to make necessarily like immediate sense. It's kind of like an exercise in thought or whatever. I guess maybe that's not what he's intending, but like it would just mean, small Israel, small Palestine, like small, no irredentism or expansionism on either side, right? That seems like what is being like said here. I don't know, where the hell did I leave off? It is an argument that for socialists, anti-Zionism cannot be an unqualified political label, implying a historically rigid attitude to Israeli Jewish self-determination. Socialist opposition to Zionism should be contextualized by a sensitivity to its historical origins, i.e. the reality of the oppression that impelled its growth, and should support the leveling up of rights between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs as the democratic alternative to Zionism. While Marxists have historically drawn distinctions between nationalisms of the oppressed and of the oppressor, particularly the Leninist Marxist, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, perhaps more than any other form of nationalism, shows that these categories are unstable, geographically variable, and historically traversable. Jewish nationalism was a nationalism of the oppressed in pre-war Europe, and in the Zionist states after the Second World War, even while it was in the process of becoming an oppressor nation in Palestine. That history should also give pause to leftists who advocate the realization of Palestinian national rights via the extirpation of the national rights of Israeli Jews, merely reversing the poles of oppression than achieving equality. One second. As Martin Thomas wrote, quote, "It is true that the nationalism of an oppressed nation is different from the nationalism of an oppressor nation. The demand for free speech from those socially bred to deference and self-effacement is different from the same demand from those educated in the voice of command. Yet free speech is only free speech, not a guarantee that what the previously self-effacing say must be true. National rights are only national rights and not a guarantee that what the previously oppressed nation does with those rights must be ideal. Nationalism of any stripe putting nation above class is alien to socialism." End quote, Martin Thomas. What then did Steve Cohen, a thoroughgoing revolutionary, an internationalist opponent of borders and a determined advocate of international solidarity, mean when he called himself a, quote, anti-Zionist Zionist, end quote? And how might the thinking behind this tongue-in-cheek description help us today? Cohen described his anti-Zionist Zionism like this, quote, "On the one hand, Zionism is undoubtedly, unquestionably racist towards the Palestinians, which is why I'm an anti-Zionist. On the other hand, it is seen, and I think correctly seen, by most Jews as anti-racist. It is anti-racist in that it was and is a response by Jews to extricate themselves from the racism of anti-Semitism. Maybe not your way of fighting racism, maybe not mine, but anti-racist nonetheless. And the majority of Jews in the world today view Israel as a, quote, bolt hole, end quote, were Nazism to arise again. It is in response to this political contradiction that I've started to assume the somewhat novel self-description of being an anti-Zionist Zionist. I am an anti-Zionist like no other. Maybe I exaggerate. In that I refuse to accept anti-Zionist myths and untruths. I am a Zionist unlike no other. Here I don't exaggerate, in that I am opposed to the state of Israel. The only way out of this contradiction, a political contradiction, not one of my personal pathology, is the unity of Palestinian/Jewish workers within Palestine/Israel, combined with a relentless fight against anti-Semitism internationally, end quote. Cohen. Anti-Zionist Zionism in this context is a way of confronting the contradictions of history that an unqualified anti-Zionism or Zionism blur out. Cohen allows us to express solidarity with two conflicting historical experiences at once and discharge elementary duties of solidarity to both Jews and Arabs. The spirit of Cohen's anti-Zionist Zionism suggests a leftism that seeks to integrate both its historical analyses, the perspectives and consciousness of both the Jewish refugee from the Holocaust, confronting British colonialism to demand their right to immigrate to Palestine and self-determine as part of an established Jewish community there, and those of the Palestinian displaced and later subjected to occupation as part of that process of national formation and state foundation. From a specifically Jewish perspective, the spirit of anti-Zionist Zionism offers the potential for a recasting of Jewish identity that integrates solidarity with the Palestinians while continuing to uphold a Jewish right to self-definition and self-determination. Cohen did not share my programmatic conclusions about Israel-Palestine. Reading his work reveals a utopian semi-anarchist streak, and he preferred what he called a, quote, no-state solution, end quote, to both a two-state settlement and the, quote, smash Israel, end quote, program of left anti-Semitism. But his way of thinking about the issue, which presupposed that the left should be in historic sympathy with the experiences that impelled Jewish immigration to Palestine, while also resolutely opposing Israel's oppression of the Palestinians and advocating equality between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, provides a clear antidote to left anti-Semitism. To return to Deutscher's analogy of the burning building, Cohen's anti-Zionist Zionism implies a politics that preaches hostility to the people who set the fire, but equality and solidarity between the one who jumped and the bystander they injured. To anyone stirred by instinctive emotional opposition to oppression, either their own or someone else's, it can seem like pettifogging unreasonableness to insist on particular parameters for the form and content of criticism of Israel. What does it matter, one might ask, if the Palestinians and their supporters sometimes go a little overboard? Isn't that understandable? Surely it is the Israeli state that needs policing, not people's criticisms of it. So what if some Jews get offended? Doesn't their possible offense pale into insignificance compared with the material suffering of the Palestinians? Yes, in one sense it does, and it is indeed understandable that a Palestinian victim of Israeli occupation would be especially intense in their hostility to the Israeli state. But if our aim is not merely opposition, any opposition to Israel, but the advancement of a democratic socialist internationalism, then some critiques will hinder, not help. To embrace, quote, smash Israel, end quote, type absolute anti-Zionism because it expresses maximal opposition to the Israeli state and can thus energize more determined solidarity with the Palestinians is a trap, as well as needlessly pitting the case of Palestinian solidarity against the vast majority of Jews. It binds any advancement for Palestinian rights to an outcome that, barring a mass collective disavowal of national rights by Israeli Jews, unprecedented throughout all of human history, could be achieved only by bloody force. It would be a contemporary rerun of the, quote, racial war on the Jews of Palestine, end quote, and as such would undoubtedly amplify anti-Semitism across the region and beyond. The fact that such a sequence of events is extremely unlikely does not make it any less reactionary. It is rare for lasting equality and justice to emerge from ashes. More usually, they are fertile ground for ongoing cycles of nationalist resentment and revanchism. Socialist internationalism is a class politics. It cannot be nationalist, neither Jewish nor Israeli Jewish, nor Arab or Palestinian, even while it supports the right of national groups to self-determination and, if they wish, to statehood. The socialist perspective is not merely for the realization of the national aspirations of oppressed peoples, but for the construction of a working-class movement capable of overthrowing capitalism, necessarily involving workers in oppressor nations as well as oppressed ones. If the left cannot construct an active support for Palestinian self-determination on the basis of consistent democracy and equal rights, which advocates transnational workers' unity rather than revanchist counternationalism, our politics are doomed. The starting point of an approach informed by Cohen's version of anti-Zionist Zionism would be active campaigning for equality between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. In the first instance, this means vigorous opposition to both the Israeli occupation and racism against Palestinians. It would make practical solidarity in that cause, supporting left-wing and labor movement forces organizing in both Israel and Palestine, and especially those seeking to organize across national and communal divides, and build Israeli Jewish/Palestinian Arab unity on a class basis, such as Omdim Be Yahad, WAC Ma'an, the Workers' Advice Center, and others. It would oppose attempts to close down legitimate criticism of Israeli policy by claiming that any such criticism is necessarily anti-Semitic. An anti-Zionist Zionist approach would involve such things as opposition both to blanket boycotts of Israel and to attempts to treat Zionists like fascists, no-platform Zionists, or drive Zionists out of left-wing spaces. Supporters of this perspective would fight for genuine free speech in the labor movement and on the left, for all political factions and tendencies, including both supporters and opponents of BDS. It would acknowledge that there are organic Zionist tendencies within our own movement, broadly defined, that have as much a right to organize and express themselves as any other tendency, including anti-Zionist ones. This perspective recognizes that some affinity with the idea of Israel, if not the state itself, amongst Jews, whether or not this is labeled as Zionism, is an understandable product of historic Jewish experience. It seeks to give Jews the ideological tools to overcome particularist nationalist instincts and move towards a universalist political perspective and consciousness. It can celebrate and promote revolutionary universalist political traditions within Jewish history, but does not demand of Jews that they overcome the entirety of historically accumulated consciousness on the pain of being damned as racist or driven out of the left. Damned as racist and driven out of the left. Anti-Zionist Zionism does not make support for political outcomes that presuppose the non-existence of Israel, which are at best utopian and at worst wholly reactionary and anti-Semitic, a precondition for political legitimacy. It makes support for universal human and democratic rights and support for the material advancement of the rights of the Palestinian national community. Its litmus test for judging politics on Israel-Palestine, not whether a person or group calls themselves Zionist or anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionist Zionism is in fact a call for a renewed political discourse on the left and can leave the terms, quote, Zionist and, quote, anti-Zionist behind altogether, or at least return them to their proper proportions. Human rights activist Iyad el-Baghdadi wrote, quote, "From my many conversations and interactions with Israelis, I can now see that there are two Israels. One is an Israel that is a safe haven and cultural homeland for the Jewish people. Another is an Israel which is a sophisticated, well-oiled machine of institutional repression. ... Peace is only possible with the first Israel. No peace is possible with the second Israel." End quote. This is the contradiction and duality I believe Cohen's Anti-Zionist Zionism aimed to express, acknowledging that a democratic confrontation with the, quote, second Israel, end quote, based on internationalist unity between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, and centrally between Arab and Jewish workers, required an understanding of the first. In 2007, Cohen wrote, quote, "There can be no liberation through any movement infected with anti-Semitism, and there can be no struggle against anti-Semitism which articulates a position detrimental to the Palestinians. One struggle, one fight," end quote. Steve Cohen was right, I think. Steve Cohen was also right that, on much of the far left, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have, quote, merged. As paradoxical as it may seem, the only way to decouple them is to consciously fuse the imperative for solidarity with the Palestinians with an active struggle against anti-Semitism, including and perhaps especially on the left, in order to construct a politics based on consistent democracy and struggle for equal rights. That is the radical, emancipatory potential of the provocation of anti-Zionist Zionism, the way out of the ideological trap set by left anti-Semitism. It is up to us to fulfill that potential. The end. Thank you for listening.